Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. We have now a little less than an hour to talk. So I'll briefly introduce everyone, and then they'll each take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and lively discussion. So our first two guests seated together here are from Milestone Film and Video Distribution Company and many other things. So Dennis Doros and Amy Heller, co-founders. Probably all of you in this room have seen at least several films from Milestone, including restorations, and probably have a library of DVDs. Dennis is also a member of the Association of Moving Image Archivists Board of Directors. So someone from the private sector. And then we have Elena Rossi Snook on the far end from New York Public Library, Library of the Performing Arts Film and Video Reference Collection. Did I get that right? I did, okay.
It's the Reserve Film and Video Collection.
Yes, who also serves on the AMI board and is a well-known activist for film qua film in this day and age, and also a film producer, I guess, at this point. And Bill Brand, longtime filmmaker in the experimental and avant-garde world, who by accident became a preservationist because he had an optical printer and could make copies of small gauge films. And so if you've seen an experimental film that's been preserved in the last 25 or 30 years, he probably did it. And he also teaches at Hampshire College and teaches film preservation at NYU. So quite a panoply of talents that we have here. So I've asked Milestone to open up with some thoughts about this topic of film preservation in the digital era and the transition.
Well, we are a very small company. In fact, we are the company. And we've been working in restoring and preserving films since we started almost more than 24 years ago. So we've been living through the changes of standards and of now the revolution from analog to digital. And there have been upsides and downsides for each step of the way. Most recently, we've been working on the restoration of the films of Shirley Clarke. And I think that Dennis is going to talk about specifically the restoration of Portrait of Jason, which I think is a kind of a parable that tells a lot about both the changing world between film and digital restoration, and about the strengths and weaknesses of each.
Okay, I don't want to go through the entire story because it took 3 years of my life, but it took 3 years to find material for Portrait of Jason. What had existed before was a battered 35 millimeter print at MoMA, and they preserved it, thank God, because it was the only material that anybody found. But it took me 3 years to find that in the Shirley Clarke collection at the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research, they had a 16 millimeter work print that turned out to be a fine grain from 1967. And it was edited up to June 6, 1967. And that's what I had. And then I found that she spent 3 more months editing the film. We did also find a 35 millimeter print in very good condition in Sweden, but we really wanted to go back to the fine grain because it was right off the camera negative. My first job in restoration was at Kino, and it took a year and a half to edit Queen Kelly together and another 6 months to edit Sadie Thompson together. Thank you. And I was really daunted by the idea of taking this 16 millimeter work print and conforming it to her final vision. I had her editing notes. I started putting in a day-to-day notes, trying to figure out how she was cutting films, how she was doing it later on. And I really worked up for 3 months how I'm going to edit this film back into the final version. And I took everything to modern video film, the 67 print from Sweden, the 16 millimeter work print, and I gave it to them, and I said, I'll be there next week. And they called back the next day and said, we got it. I said, excuse me? He said, it took 16 hours, but the computer ingested both materials and reordered the 16 millimeter print into the same order. Now, for people who've seen Portrait of Jason, it's a one-person show with a lot of talking head. And for a computer to recognize one scene from the other and putting it back together in 16 hours, which would have taken me 3 years, that's when I realized that the way I have been working all my life has changed forever. I mean, it's just that simple. I couldn't have done it. It would have cost 3 times as much if I had spent that much time in an editing suite, cutting 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter together. So that really was the digital revolution. We are still, after we did the restoration on digital, we did blow it up to 35 millimeter internegative with the Academy Film Archive. So there is 35 millimeter preservation materials. And we are still following the idea that anytime we work with an archive, we leave a negative behind. But that's, the digital world is on us now.
I want to say that another sign of the changing times is the whole way through when we were working endlessly on Jason, we assumed that we would release it in 35 millimeter as we'd released everything in 35 millimeter. By the time we finished the restoration and we had created the 35 negative and we made a 35 print, we really didn't need it. We needed the DCP. I mean, we've shown it somewhat, but going forward, will we need 35 millimeter prints?
Well, to be
We
fair,
don't know.
yeah.
Things are very, it's not clear.
Yeah, the first release we did for Shirley Clark was The Connection. There were 5 35 millimeter prints. With Portrait of Jason, there was 1 35 millimeter print and 6 DCPs. It's the reality. But the 35 millimeter print is available when people want to rent it, and they have.
Yes, mostly in Europe.
Yeah. Should anyone need a definition of DCP, this term which came into our vocabulary about 18 months ago and now is the standard?
Digital cinema package is
yeah.
the hard drive that is shown in movie theaters. That's what
Yeah.
almost
so the majority
everything,
of things
yeah.
at this festival are DCP.
And every place else.
Even if a 35 millimeter print is available. Which were the institutions who wanted 35 millimeter projection prints?
Mostly Europe, I think.
Mostly Europe. One thing is that making one answer print costs, I don't remember, $8,000?
Something like that.
And so the rental fee for the 35 millimeter print was much greater than the DCP, and given the choice, most theaters are struggling, they chose the DCP. Mm-hmm. Others might have shown the 35, but it probably played in 20 theaters in the United States and about 15 to 20 theaters around the world. It's going to Copenhagen on Monday to be screened.
And then even between the time when we released that film and even between January 1st and now, a number of the theaters in this country that showed only 35 millimeter, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Cleveland Cinematheque, are now either changed over or changing over so that they can show both. Yeah, it's just, it's been forced upon the industry by the studios, and so it's happening. And even those of us who are really committed to 35 millimeter and continue to pay storage on many, many 35 millimeter prints and don't want to give up on 35 millimeter, we're in the reality of the world. Things have changed.
And as a distributor, is there also an alternative for, maybe not for a theatrical release like Portrait of Jason, but for smaller stuff? So DCP, not everyone who wants digital can show DCP, and if they can't show 35, are you able to share files, in other forms which aren't necessarily DCP encrypted, but could still be projected?
When I left work, there were 3 computers working on 4 different films to send films out to the Gagosian Gallery here. One was going out to Spanish television. They were just chomping up materials to send out.
And do you ship them a file on a drive or a Blu-ray disc?
Internet.
Internet, okay.
Internet now.
Yeah. Elena, I think you wanted to
Me?
follow next. Yes.
Okay. Where to start? This will get much more interesting when you folks get involved. So the Q&A will light up my part of the discussion at least. But I'll lay some groundwork so you know where I'm coming from. I'm really lucky. I get to work outside of the commercial industry. So I don't have the pressure to make something that's marketable, which puts me in a position of being able to do what I believe is the right thing by the film rather than the right thing commercially, which are not always in sync. So I'm at the New York Public Library, and we have a collection that we still lend. Like, that is what we do. You come in with a library card, and you leave with a 16mm film. And that is something that we actively protect. So when we do a preservation, we don't just preserve the film, we preserve the entire act. Like, yes, you have to come in person, you have to interact with people. If you're gonna see it here, you have to sit in the dark and like watch something on a screen. So that entire, we're very mindful of preserving that entire activity. When we approach an actual film preservation, we are looking at how was this film originally conceived, yes, how was it rendered, and then how was it presented in the non-theatrical market. So I'm searching for a really good example. Okay, we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, but Los Sures played here at the film festival as a DCP. This film was preserved on film with an analog workflow, which means we found a film master, we sent it to a lab, we got new film negatives made and new film prints. In this specific case, the filmmaker is still alive and well, and because we didn't have original camera negatives to work from, we had a compromised print. And the result was good, but it was still many generations away from the original camera negatives. So he wasn't really happy with it showing in a very large venue. There was some softness in the focus as a result of moving so many generations away. And so Union Docs, they also were interested in this film, and they did a digital transfer, which resulted in the DCP. And it looked sharp, and it showed really well. So both of these versions are legitimate presentations of this work. As far as categorizing it as one as being archival or restoration or conservation, I am very particular about the use of those words. You know, we conserve films at the library by putting our prints in cold storage. That's conservation. We preserved Los Sures because what we preserved was the film as it existed in 1983 as a distribution product in the non-theatrical market. Like, what we received, that print, our preservation comes really close to how it looked. The digital remastering, and now I've switched language, it's a remastering because in the process of scanning it, they worked with the filmmaker to go in and reconceptualize the color scheme to make it more contemporary, a little bit brighter, sharper. They were able to resolve the sharpness issues, which is something I'm a little bit jealous of, to make the blacks really black and to make the dupiness look go away. But there were ultimately changes that were made because they could be made, and because in this case, the filmmaker was the client to the lab, whereas when I'm the client, like, we don't change anything. So I don't know. I guess
I asked the question. You used the word preservation.
Yeah.
So we 16mm film, preserve on 16mm film. Is it sufficient to say, okay, I want to make a preservation negative for cold storage? Preservation is done, and therefore the print or the distribution thing could be separate from that. In other words, you could consider a 16mm film preserved just by making the negative and the storage thing, not necessarily worrying about the distribution, print, or other copies.
the way I approach it is actually not from the position of what you end up with. I think that's like a very West Coast approach to thinking about when you use preservation versus restoration. Like, it took me a long time of working with our friends in the studios to realize that our language was a little bit off. So when you deal with, like, especially studio big time commercial restoration, preservation, they use the word preservation to indicate that something has been done analog on film, and restoration is a digital workflow. For me, I look at it as, well, did we preserve the film or did we restore it? Like, restore, as in actually bring it back to what it was, not reinvent it or make it what it could have been or what you would like it to have been. So when we preserve a film, it means that we were not able to bring it back to its original identity and condition. When we preserve a film, we are duplicating the way it looks at this moment. When we restore a film, it means that we have gotten as close as I can get using contemporary film stocks to capture that look. We did a restoration of a film called Village Sunday, which was shot on 16. We only had some really bad blow-up 35 material that we couldn't use because then the aspect ratio was all off. So I had this one reversal print. When you deal with reversal, I mean, it's the color saturation is just beautiful. The grain is gorgeous. But you're talking about a print, which is a positive to a negative. Oh, you're going to accumulate more grain and saturation there. And then from that negative, you have to go on to new prints, which means more grain, more saturation. And it's just a matter of finding your vendors, finding the labs that you like, finding the people at the labs, making it like a really human process as far as I'm concerned. Like, I like that human process. And of course, having lots of conversations about what it should look like and what your goals are. And I think we got really close in our release print to looking like Reversal from the 1950s. Would I love to have access to Reversal print stock? Yeah, you bet. Like, one of my favorite people talking about this is Paolo Cerchi-Usai on one of the Treasures of American Film Archives discs. He talks about a Martha Graham silent film. It's an early color process that they did restoration. And as he's narrating on the DVD, he says, but what is restoration here? We can't possibly restore it. We don't have nitrate film stocks. So you approximate. Technically, we could wipe everything off the restoration table and say nothing's been restored. Nothing is going to look exactly the way it was presented. And then even then, are we restoring the intention? The creative drives a lot of restoration projects on the West Coast. It's what the filmmaker conceived, what their creative idea was. That's what you're restoring. On the East Coast here, it's like, no, I'm restoring what actually got made. For me, it's what people experienced in the theater. That's what counts. So I'm sorry, Stephen, if you couldn't get the boats to not park in your shot of Jaws, too bad. That's what is part of the film. You restore that.
Is
you
he
don't
here
go
tonight?
in.
Is Stephen here?
No.
You were looking up there.
And I've promised myself to be more moderate because you guys are my friends. But but that's how I feel. Like, I don't think you can reinvent your creative product just because you have the power to do so. With great power comes great responsibility.
I'll say.
Did you know that?
I learned that from you, I believe. Actually, something
So.
you just said reminds me, is kind of a good segue to Bill Brand's work, but you also work with creative. You work with living filmmakers or filmmakers who you have a pretty clear understanding of what they would have wanted, regardless of what materials come to you. You want to talk about how your mode of operation at BB Optics is different than what's been mentioned so far, or you can talk about anything you want. Bill Brand.
Well, it's very coincident, but I think that when we're talking, whenever we're talking about film, and this is a great panel because we're representing different aspects of it. I mean, there's distribution, there's conservation, and then I'm coming in both as preservation and as an artist. So what is the concern? Well, if we're talking about conservation, film is it. I mean, it works, it lasts, and it's cheap, believe it or not. I mean, it'll last a really long time, and it won't cost a lot to keep it. But we don't control that. The market controls that, and the world moves along. So we're all moving towards digital because we have no choice, because that improves the short-term profit margin of the people who are in control. So what are the opportunities that brings us, and what are the obligations that brings to us? In terms of preservation, in terms of restoration, it's fantastic. I mean, you can do things with digital that you just can't do film to film. It's tremendous opportunity. As Elena says, with power comes responsibility. So the question gets to be not what can I do, but what should I do? And that's where the knowledge here and the experience we have about what things should look like, what the experience of seeing them in their context is and was, and becomes even more important, because it's not just a technical set of possibilities. So I asked the question, if I'm preserving a film, what is the film? What is, is it the content? And if so, what is the content? And the example I'd like to give, because I come as an experimental filmmaker starting in the late 60s and the 70s, and a lot of the work we did and a lot of the work that I preserve now focused on the physical medium of film itself, right? We're talking about a period of art where the materials of art coming out of constructivism is really the subject of the work itself. So I have films that I'm preserving. I've made films myself that I'm also preserving where the subject is things like scratches. So you can represent those on digital, but ontologically, what does it mean compared to the ideas that the artist had in the first place? And there's no answers to any of these questions. We don't have, it's always been and always will be a moving target. So for instance, is it enough to, as Elena says, to make something in digital that looks as close to the object as you can? Well, what is the object? Is it the experience of seeing it in the theater? Which theater? Lincoln Center, where you have a big, great projection and great big screen, or the kind of place where we mostly looked at our films, which is in people's homes on the small screen with a school-type projector? So what is the goal here? And again, there's no answer. There's no single answer. It used to be, we can't represent these on video because it's so soft and it's so unsaturated, and then suddenly it was, we can't represent these on video because they're so sharp and it's so perfect. So that wasn't it. So it's a fascinating field to be in, but the more obsolete I become in my knowledge, the less obsolete I become in a sense, because I think that it's the knowledge that we have and the decisions we make and how we perform the art of preservation. And Ross Lippmann, that Dennis works with all the time, has named this the gray zone. It's really, it involves a lot of science, but it's not a science, it is an art.
So did you have Milestone have a response?
I was just going to say that also it involves a lot of history. I mean, and you bring tremendous knowledge and expertise, but it's also history that you can learn. One of the things for Portrait of Jason was that working on The Connection, which was Shirley Clark's first film, she talked about how she wanted it to look grittier, and then she kept fighting her DP because he wanted it to look really good, and it does look really good, and that wasn't exactly what she had in mind. So
when Portrait Jason was finished, I usually spend 120 hours of digital cleanup on a film, and I said, why don't we do this? And they started laughing at me, singing, and they said, you understand it's cleaner already than the release print in 1967, and you can spend 1,000 hours and you'd just be wasting your time because nobody's going to notice. And that's when I realized her optical work, I'm sorry to say, was cheaply done in the 50s and 60s. Portrait of Jason does have a lot of crap on it, and we kept the crap perfectly as it was in 1967.
crap.
Well, and this is a constant problem, because even those of us who know better, you really want to do it, right? You want to make, you spend all that money and all that effort, and to make it only as good as it was, when you could do something that, well, what does better mean? But by some standards has more of something, which means less of something else. And if you have, a living filmmaker and a living archivist and an institution you're working for, you're caught between a lot of forces, and often the artist wants to remake the work that they made, and I'm sorry, this isn't a grant to remake your work. This is a preservation grant that I'm obligated to deliver what you did 40 years ago. And so I'm always in that position of having to say, okay, well, we can take out this splice, but no, you can't replace your titles, and you can't add a new scene. And when
well, you can, but it's a different project with different funding for a different occasion.
So when the New York Public Library, that's preserved some of my films, was asked to include it in a release from the National Film Preservation Foundation, the devil got in me, and I said, I've always wanted to fix this problem in my film. So I posed this as a possibility to so you tell this story.
Okay. So, so we got the call that the film was going to be on a DVD. And it's not one that I worked on. I didn't have to because Bill was working on it. He's really, really good. He's like, this is one of the vendors that we like want to work with because he just knows his stuff. So I was like, yeah, sure. I think it was Circles of Confusion. I was like, this is awesome. What an honor. And Bill responded with just this mention, oh, I'm going to run this software program against it and finally remove those white specks. And I was like, I guess this makes me like good at my job. I was just like born into this world. And this little like ulcer flared up in my stomach and was like, remove white specks. And this story surfaced in my head. I had no idea how I remember this. I said, Bill, are those the white specks that were a result of you like having the negative out? And was it a party? And who said?
No. It was a reversal original, and I wasn't careful enough. I was young.
I thought it was at a party, and someone sat on the negative at a party. I had this vision of this
different
wild,
film, different story.
wild
story.
70s party. But anyways, the damage occurred like at the point of production. So I was like, well, has there ever been a print that didn't have the white specks? No, it's in the negative. I was like, I'm sorry. It's got to for this DVD, because it's a DVD representing archival work. It has to stay. But that's like the point. I mean, like I'm here as the ringer for film, but the point we're all getting to is like we just need to have access to the full toolbox. You know, it's the people involved who just allow us to make the decisions that we have to make. So in this case, like, yeah, because it's a DVD release, which is amazing, by the way. Like, as an instructor, having all of this material to use in the classroom is fantastic without, having to find prints that are, that have soundtracks married to them to teach silent film. I am in full support of the digital world. But I also like clarity and transparency and even distribution of things into categories. So for Bill's work, if it's going to be called a preservation or a restoration and it's going on a DVD that's advertising as such, it has to represent what that work is, what its nature is and always has been. But if Bill wants to take that and say, look, the white specks were never part of the artistic intent. It's really BS that they're there, and they have to go. Like, yeah, he should totally go in, like, apply some digital cleanup, take them out of there, and re-release it on DVD himself. Yeah. But we just have to be really clear in communicating to the audience what they're going to get, what that product is, and where it came from.
You were, of course, right. I just wanted to be the other guy.
If you had not been a structuralist filmmaker, we would have let you get away with fixing a scratch. But you made the argument the scratch is important. So we have 30 minutes left. I think there's a lot of expertise in the audience. So why don't we start with questions? And we're recording this, so a handheld mic will come to every hand that's called upon.
Two quick questions. A quick one about the Shirley Clark. Will those be on DVD, or are they already on DVD? I saw the Ornette Coleman one, which was great.
Actually, yeah, we have in covering my basement around my desk is the Ornette and Portrait of Jason coming out November 11th.
Excellent.
We have Metropolis Post up there who just finished the last 8 short films, thank you, of that she did. They just finished preserving them, restoring them on digital. So the volume 2 and 3, I'm really perverse to, is coming out in November, and volume 1 and 4 are coming out early next year. Yes.
All right. So here's the question, really, about partly is about the philosophical issue that you raised, Bill. And I think I talked to Stan Brakhage at the Donnell Library about 20 years ago, and he had no answer for this. But I figured that some of his films were meant to decay over time, that these were not just structural films, but that with, scratches and things, but that they would always change each time they would be projected because of natural living organism. And the flip side of that, which I want, your name Elena?
Elena.
Yeah. I'm a television archivist, or collector myself, and to look at the reissues of 60s television shows that look better than they could have ever possibly looked when they were first aired, considering the technology and What is your philosophical point of view on that?
I am so glad you asked that.
Okay, so it's two
I'm
questions.
so glad you
They're probably
asked.
also correctly displaying it 16:9, right? When many people get their hands on them.
Ratio, but like Gilligan's Island looks
Yeah.
like unbelievable. And Mary Tyler Moore.
Okay, I'll answer that first because like there are certain conversations that consistently like come up in my life and I get to rehearse them and get better at my answers. So I was actually just talking to the lab about this and like this idea of the science of like not just perception, but the way our moving images align us with certain times, you know, and all of our experience and how we attach our experience to the film, to the time. So for me, it's The Grinch That Stole Christmas and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Like, I didn't even know that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was a Technicolor show, like the one that played on cable forever and ever, right? With like the blonde actor and the Gene Wilder. Okay. Yeah, so that was, yeah, but this is still a good example. Okay, so that was a Technicolor show. I didn't know that because I grew up in the 80s when it showed on TV pretty consistently. And whatever the US master for broadcast was, it was like orange, brown, and avocado. That was the color scheme. Like, you know what I mean too, like the burnt orange, like the corduroys, that kind of burnt orange. So for me, like that was the look of that film. So when they did the restoration and it was like really bright and shiny, I was like, what the hell is this? You know, like this is crap, like rah rah. And people were like, no, this is actually, there was a Technicolor show. Like this is how it was supposed to look. And I was like, that's really interesting because my relationship to this film is, I can't, it's not that, you know. And the Grinch is another one. Like the Grinch is puke green. The Grinch is this vomit-colored green until he got remastered, and now he's like really bright and shiny. And the way we relate to images and create a sense of placement, like when you look at a photograph and it's faded a certain way to a certain degree with a certain amount of red, like you know that photograph is 1975. You just know it, you know, and we know it collectively to the extent that there's software programs to make your born digital footage look that way. You know, the idiom of the classroom film is so universal that if it's not red, faded, and scratched, it doesn't have any cachet to it. So for me, like my response is that like, this is totally crazy, but yes, those versions are legitimate. You know, I don't know, like, would I go as far as saying, I'm going to restore that to being, like, red, faded, and scratched? No, but, like, I'm a really big supporter of conservation. Keep it in cold storage. Keep it accessible. Like, just watch it until it falls apart. Enjoy that version of it. You don't have to have it be really bright and shiny for it to be valuable. Like, yeah, the idea of a film continuing to decay and have that be part of the work, like, yes. Just put it, like, what are we doing? What are we saving it for? Like, what is even the protocol for future generations? Are they going to submit an application like, oh, we would like to access this now. Can you please take it out of the vault? Like, I don't care about creating a time capsule. I want people to come in to watch films that are going to move them, that are going to change who they are, because that's what happened to me. You know, I came to New York. I watched films from the 70s about what was going on politically and peace marches, and I understood everything I'd ever wanted to understand about social change. And it like made me the person I am. And I would rather pass that on to this generation and this students and this group of 20-year-olds and have them be better people and then maybe have the film die in 50 years than to have this perfect replication of it that, you know, you watch on a little 2x3-inch screen on your phone.
Thank you. Question again up front. Mike's coming to your right.
I came here because I had heard the scare stories about how digital was going to just dissolve faster than film did. And so you sort of skipped that level of the discussion, and I still would like to know what that reality is. And the second concern I came with, there was a show at the Smithsonian called Sensations, and a curator had taken a David Wanilovich clip and then edited it and added soundtrack and had made it what he thought was a better film. You talked about the possibility of the technology allowing anyone to come in and take a creative work and quote unquote make it better. So what's the ethical question, and what is the criteria that is used? I pretty much understand the New York Public Library would not do any of this, but the potential with technology to get a hold of a print from the New York Public Library and fuck with, and do things to it is what I want to know what the ethical value
So
is.
2 questions. The first was about whether or not digital files have a shorter lifespan in cold storage than films do. I don't know if Dennis or Amy want to address that, but Bill actually did the preservation work on the Voinerovich film you're talking about, so we'll let him take that question second.
The answer to the first question is that digital is far more volatile than analog film because though it's virtual, it lives on something that's not virtual. And hard drives don't last, technology changes. So it's far less permanent object than analog. However, digital can be disseminated very widely. So countering that is the fact that you can have multiple copies all over the world. I mean, thousands, millions, so something will survive. The other thing is that given that digital is one, society will find protocols for maintaining it. And there are protocols. It's just expensive. And that's good for some people because you'll always have to keep rebuying this product.
So YouTube video, what is the lifespan of that?
What is the lifespan of a YouTube video? Well, what is a YouTube video? It's a file on a hard drive somewhere that's backed up by another hard drive somewhere that's backed up by another hard drive somewhere.
And it could be a QuickTime movie that I made, or it could be the highest,
Right.
studio file.
So
That's
3 to
been
5
posted.
years. But it'll last longer than that because there are so many copies, so many places, and so many interests in maintaining it.
You want to say a word about the ethics and the Voinerovich, the gallery who kind of misrepresented it?
Well, that's a very complicated and interesting story. That's where, it's only people like all of us who continually enact ethics are going to maintain a relationship with an artistic and cultural object, but also a context, because it's wonderful that anything can be made from anything. I mean, this is the postmodern world we live in, but with great power comes great responsibility. So
I heard that, Amy.
I was going to say, the idea of appropriating images and materials has certainly existed before the digital age. And if you think about hip-hop, musicians used turntables before they were, using digital files. People were appropriating images in film as well. It's easier to do now. And it has brought us to a different place in a number of ways, both with music and with film, with the issue of fair use, which could be like a whole different panel, and which is complicated and not.
If you create a new work from appropriation and you label it as such, and whoever did it labels it, that, as I understood it when I went to see it, was presented as a David Wallalovish work.
Not a new work. Yeah, well, it is complicated.
I mean, the irony of that story is that with good intention, the people who reworked this piece put it in the show at the National Portrait Gallery. It became a cause célèbre because it was withdrawn because of objections, and then there were calls of censorship. But actually, the object that was created was a kind of unconscious, unwillful censorship itself, because what they did in creating this work was actually negate a lot of what that particular work is about and focus it into one particular interpretation that is historically incorrect and has a whole interesting way it came
The
about.
controversy was more about sexual content than about bad restoration, right? So.
Right, right. So anyway, that's too much of a digression.
Question over here.
Yeah, hi. To answer, to think about the question about YouTube, Blip was another service like that was supposed to be more ethical and pure or whatever, and they went out of business. And I had 78 films posted on Blip, which luckily somebody told me it was that who worked there said they haven't really erased the hard drive yet. You can still get it, and I was able to get them. But if you didn't know, you didn't know it. But I wanted to mention, in terms of Shirley Clark, my mentor, that I just wish that the cool world could be freed up, and Frederick Wiseman has kept a very big foot on top of it. And he did when Shirley was still alive, and it was one of the tragedies of her life. And then I also just wanted to mention, in terms of like migrating materials from one medium to another, thank God the Copyright Office made all those early films have paper copies, because otherwise we wouldn't have any of those films.
For those who don't know, Dee Dee Halleck, revolutionary film educator, well represented in the collection at New York Public Library. So she knows what of what she speaks. Actually, if I could just, I'm glad that you brought up the whole YouTube thing, because this is a part of the conversation that is not often discussed when it comes to archiving. Proprietary technology. What are we going to do if someone develops something that is unique to their archive, their studio, their holdings? I mean, that's a really good question. Everyone's talking about the cloud, like storing it in the cloud. Who's like Google? Is Google going to be our vault? Like, okay, that's assuming Google lives on indefinitely. You know, I hope that there's a backup plan for that. That, I guess that's my only thing, is that it does need to be a discussion.
Yeah. Back row. Coming your way, microphone.
I wanted to ask about encryption and how that relates to DCP. I'm curious if the DCPs for a portrait of Jason are encrypted when they go out, or if the DCPs that the library makes are encrypted, and do you guys see encryption as a threat to archiving and preservation?
We don't encrypt our DCPs because it's not that there's no value to encryption, but we're not afraid that people are going to be ripping off our DCPs, and it's a misery for the projectionists. Encryptions fail, and we just think it's not necessary, and so we don't. And a number of independent distributors don't encrypt. We've had the experience, though, this year, releasing a series with Martin Scorsese, the Masterpieces of Polish Cinema series that played at Lincoln Center, and those were all encrypted, and the studio in Poland has been handling the keys, and it's worked fine. So, I mean, whether that could be a problem for, I don't think DCPs are an archival medium. So I think that looking to your DCP, it could end up being the only existing thing, and then in that case, perhaps encryption could be a bar to. I guess probably there'd be a way to break it.
Until very recently, the Library of Congress would not accept a DCP as a copyright deposit. Now I think that's been worked out, but it was an issue, mostly because of encryption, but not only so. Elena, did you want to add? He asked about the library.
We don't do anything on DCP. I laugh, ha ha ha. I make release prints. If you try to dupe my print, I'll know it. I'll find you. I'll break your legs. Don't do it.
But
Go ahead, Bill.
well, if what we're doing is preserving things in their state of origin, and films are born digital, and DCP is the way that they were distributed, what does that mean? We wish it weren't, but wishes don't. We don't get to have that wish.
Yeah.
The DCP is a compressed. It's not a good archival format. It's not where the film. I mean, this is not something I know a tremendous amount about, but there is a format that is uncompressed that I think it's called the DCM maybe, but it's something that's used on the way to making the DCP, but it's so massive that they're never saved.
Actually, we do. I have 30, 40, 4 terabyte drives, 5 terabyte drives. They impress my son tremendously, he tells his friends. But yeah, the DPX files, and the studios save them too. But to be honest, as this is a sort of vanity thing, I do think we are in a tsunami of digital age where we criticize the studios and everybody because there's only 22% of silent films exist today. I think we might have a survival rate of digital-born films now in 100 years. That's going to be far worse.
That's the real fear, is that all these films now that are in films that are not only born digital, but are converted to digital, well, from the last 10 years, that were shot on film, but exported to digital and then edited digitally. If there's no 35s made, if there's no film preservation made, and all the now born digital stuff, which everything is born digital, there's a real fear that because digital is not archival, that we're going to lose generations of filmmaking and generations of history.
Yeah.
You know, when they had the earthquake at Universal, I mean, they were able to recoup their losses pretty significantly. But now with the LTO tapes, like if you drop the LTO tape on the ground, like it's done. Game over.
Yeah. My losing battle is to get people who shoot on digital video, edit on digital video, and distribute on digital video to stop calling their works films. But I think I've just lost that battle. The word is here to stay. Question in the back row?
Yeah, you half went there already, I think, a little bit. When you brought up the 35 millimeter print of Portrait of Jason and where it might go, I thought of the New Beverly, which now under Quentin Tarantino is apparently going to be a film-only enclave. But
it did show at the New Beverly in 35
it did.
millimeter.
But what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that he's shooting himself in the foot because so much is only going to be on DCP and is never going to get struck as a 35 print. And I guess he's not going to overturn the industry back to what it was, even if he's holding out honorably. And just could you talk about this problem a little bit?
Well, I've heard amazing stories about Quentin Tarantino going back to the 80s when we first heard about him. He has been a good person for a lot of people in the industry behind the scenes. So I can't really criticize him as a person. This is his philosophy and this is what he wants to do. If he wants to run the New Beverly that way, there are 30 other theaters in Los Angeles that will play the films. The big loss is Michael Torgan, who's a great programmer and who ran that theater for so many years. But in terms of what Quentin's going to do with the films, God bless him, and I hope people come.
I think that the question is, like, the terminology around this shift has been so like end of the world. You know, it's like, oh, film is what? Dead. No, it's just been a shift. It's just been a paradigm shift. Do we have a film as the standard for commercial release? No, we don't. That's no longer here. But will we still have film prints? Yeah. I mean, Orwo is making film stock over in Brooklyn. You can take a workshop on how to make your own film emulsion, you know, here and in Colorado and in Toronto. So if Quentin and other theaters, and there are those theaters who are hybrid booths that can show film as well, I think there'll be enough of a market for somebody. It's just a matter of coming together with the stock manufacturers, with the labs, and saying, okay, who's going to be able to support this niche market now? It's just a matter of readjusting the scheme.
The second row, and then the third row after that.
I was wondering if anyone on the panel could talk a little bit about I mean, actually, Elena mentioned this earlier with reference to Jaws. You know, the films that end up getting restored often also restored multiple times, redundantly, in my opinion, sometimes. It has a lot to do with what is a commercial asset to the studios that for them, it's, if you're able to put out a Blu-ray of Jaws when you put out the, DVD of Jaws 5 years before, and you can make, a whole lot more money on it. That's what ends up sort of being the select group for what gets attention and what gets preserved and restored over and over again. And I don't know, I just was wondering if you could, as people who are outside of that system and outside of that, how do you, carve out a niche for things that don't get as much attention?
It's a good question. It's kind of the primary, my kind of map of thinking about it is to basically start with the premise that majority of films ever made no longer exist, or at least are no longer accessible. And so if we talk about restoration, I think we're mostly only talking about commercial things that still have a commercial life. And we just have to keep remembering for every one of those, there's at least 100,000 other films, everything from a home movie to an independent documentary. And the volume of what's on film in archives, well, even the archives contain the minority of what survives. They survive in many other places too. So it's the problem that institutions who are mandated to do preservation face. They have to make very difficult triage decisions about where to begin, what gets saved, and the questions of whether or not we restore a scratch is like such a luxury to have to think about that. But the real race against time is against the hundreds of thousands of film prints that aren't getting any attention at all.
And even within a single film, here are some of the nitty-gritty problems that you face, depending on what your goal is. So, as a cinematographer, you shoot film, but you know that what's going through your camera, what gets recorded on that negative, is not what you're going to see on the screen, right? You have in your mind's eye the end process, what the print is going to look like. So there's often more information on that negative that isn't going to show up. So it doesn't have to be, if you want something to be black, it doesn't have to be completely black on the negative, right? Because you know that it's going to drop out on the print. Cameras are designed so that they actually record information sometimes outside the frame that's going to get, always outside the frame that's going to get projected. Sometimes it records information between the sprocket holes, like the Zapruder film. As a conservationist, what am I preserving? Am I preserving the object and all the information on that negative? If I have the opportunity to make something, as we can now with digital, that shows the information that was never intended, do I bring that out? And then we as the audience, we're a moving target. So we're not the same people we were 50 years ago. So we have different expectations and we see something differently. So all of these things have to be considered. So it's not just all the objects that are not at the top of the ladder, but even within a single object, there's a whole set of priorities that have to be ascribed.
I'm always concerned about how we make those choices because when I started working in distribution in 1985, you learn certain things. Oh, you can always sell this kind of film. You can never sell this kind of film. And those kind of assumptions that you get handed down to you or that you come up with or that you talk about, really, I've always worked in art house cinema. The first film I ever worked on was 28 Up. The Michael Apted film, which was distributed nationwide in 16 millimeter, hundreds of places. It was amazing. Even a few years later, that was impossible. But even then, that was a film you could sell because that was a film about kids or whatever. So often those choices end up reflecting the biases we have as people, as individual people, as people, now I'm a 56-year-old Jewish woman who grew up in New Jersey. Those are things that affect how I view things. So I'm always hoping that I'm looking at the lens at which I'm making those choices so that it's not too narrow. It's not too much bound by my own experiences, because what happens is, as we know, films by men and by white men, and films that are, made with a lot of money, are the films that get preserved. So when you stop and you question those issues and you think about, well, what about films that are outside those narrow, you know, you're talking universally, I mean, home movies and, you know,
Good stuff.
all kinds of great stuff, orphan stuff. But it is important to stop and keep asking yourself when you're making those choices, how you're making those choices. So we try to really think about, okay, who is unrepresented, underrepresented, you know, and bring different images, different voices, and, you know, different film techniques to be available because, you know, as I always say, we really, really, really love to fuck with the canon. And so that's always my goal. But to do that, you have to sort of challenge yourself.
We have fuck from the audience and the panel.
Yeah,
so
sorry.
when this goes on YouTube, I'll be interested to see if the festival
I have to say
censors
that
it.
I think like the answer to that question, like I'm going to assign you all the homework of going and watching the film 2012. There's a really amazing scene in there. And the question essentially is, do we preserve bad films? Like, do we have a responsibility to preserve bad works? And so in this scene, like super brilliant scientist guy is talking to terrible writer, and you know, the world is ending, so they're loading all the great masterworks of American culture onto these ships. And so like Mona Lisa, yes, you know, great works, brilliant minds, yes, you're all living, get on the boat. And the brilliant scientist guy takes out the like really crappy first novel of this writer and goes like, haha, this too will be saved. Because this terrible novel is also a product of our civilization. And what we deem to be terrible now might be the key to everything later. So like at New York Public, we'll be showing them at the Orphan Film Symposium. We have works by teenagers. Do you know what student works look like? These are not good films. These are terrible films. If you give any teenager, I don't care if it's a film camera or an iPhone, they're gonna make a film about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. God help them, whether it's the 70s or now. But is that bad for us culturally to have a record of that? Like, no. Especially if you look at the entire output of this collection. We have like, I don't know how many films. And as a whole, I mean, to look at this point in human development, you know, when you're 14, 15, 16, and how that makes its way into art making, that's an incredible anthropological record.
And a film made with low production values in 1970,
Yeah.
regardless of what the subject is, it was made in 1970, it's immediately a time capsule, and it's going to have some mind-blowing...
and there is something really beautiful to
Yeah.
it. Like even the films that are not good films with like kids running around like smoking pot, like okay, that is a unique record, and that is useful. But then there's this film where like these two kids try to make this statement about like the Lower East Side and how there's garbage everywhere and empty lots, but if you go to Park Avenue, it's really beautiful, and they're trying to do this all within 10 minutes, you know, with an Aeroflex camera and their friends. Like that's incredible. That's worth saving.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but since you mentioned the event where you're screening your films on November 1st at the Academy Film Theater, or Academy Theater on 59th Street, which I can't announce yet, and the website hasn't gone up, but it will be all day and all night, November 1st. And Bill Brand's first 16 millimeter film, made in 1969, will have its world premiere projection on November 1st. So I want to thank you for loaning your print, this beautiful new print. We are literally out of time, and I know you want to go rush the stage for the Scorsese tickets to see the next film, but thank the panelists. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
This is so up my alley. I love it.
Oh, you were great. Here for teenagers.